Good morning. Thank you both for joining us this morning to talk about your run for treasurer. We have Elizabeth Steiner and Mary King with us today. I'm wondering if, Mary, if you wouldn't mind going first on telling us a little bit about who you are and why you're running for this position, why you're the best candidate.
Sure. My name is Mary King. I'm nominated. I was asked to run by the Oregon Working Families Party and nominated by them, and I've been co-nominated by the Pacific Green Party. I am a faculty member, retired early, an economist from Portland State, and I'm running for treasurer because the state treasurer can play a big role in creating a better future for Oregonians. And I believe the treasurer's office can do more to create good family wage jobs, stronger schools, successful businesses, and secure retirements, while also fighting climate change.
Great, thank you very much. And Elizabeth, if you can tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Hi, I'm Elizabeth Steiner. I have been a state senator for 13 years representing Northwest Portland, now downtown Portland, parts of Washington County. The vast majority of that time, I have been a budget wonk. I was the Senate co-chair of the Budget Committee for the last 6 years and stepped down from that in July to run for this office. I am the Democratic nominee for state treasurer. I'm running for state treasurer because I've seen the impact that the unfunded actuarial liability in our pension fund has on public employer budgets. And I know that reducing our unfunded liability is one of the biggest challenges facing the state, especially as we move into more financially constrained times, as we're likely to do going forward. And so it's very important that we focus a lot on making sure the pension fund is as well funded as possible, and that we respond to some of the most pressing issues of our time, which are this very complex investment climate that we find ourselves in. That includes the move away from carbon-intensive investments at a pace that's appropriate to ensure that we're still maintaining our fiduciary responsibility to grow the pension fund, while moving into green technology and green energy. I am also, as Mary is, very interested in the opportunities that Treasurer has to help Oregonians build savings through things like the 529 or College Savings Plan, Oregon Saves, and other vehicles, and to help Oregonians learn how to be more empowered financially. But the first and foremost issues that the Treasurer faces are the pension fund and the bonding that the treasurer issues on behalf of a variety of state entities, whether that's transportation or the general obligation bonds that the pension fund, that the treasurer issues.
Great, thank you. Elizabeth, let's start with you on this, and you kind of touched on this, but I'm wondering if you can go into detail about what your priorities for the office will be and what Oregonians will see 4 years from now if you're elected.
Sure. Most people understandably are not completely aware what the treasurer does. And it turns out the treasurer plays a wide range of important roles in the state. First and foremost, as I mentioned, the treasurer is the fiduciary of our Public Employee Retirement Fund, or OPERF, as it's commonly referred to. That is the pension fund that manages the assets for every public employee in the state of Oregon, whether that's for a special district or the governor herself. And it's very important that this pension fund be managed well, because if it's not, and if our unfunded actuarial liability grows, then public employers have to pay an ever-increasing percentage of their budget into the pension fund, and that's less money that's going to program. That's fewer teachers in the classrooms, that's fewer school days, that's fewer troopers on the roads. So the better funded our pension system is, the more services we can provide that are critical to Oregonians across our state. And that's something, as budget chair, that I've seen day in and day out over my entire time in the legislature. Investing the $95 to $96 billion in our pension fund, plus the other $40 billion of assets under management and treasury, is not a trivial pursuit. It is a very complex process and requires someone who really understands how to dig in and ask questions and ensure that we're following the best practices in investing, not just for the present day, but for what the investment climate will look like in 10, 15, 20 years, and that we're planning for the present and for the future to manage that. Additionally, of course, the treasurer plays an important role in a variety of financial empowerment programs, whether that's the college savings plan, which can actually be used for almost any kind of post-secondary education, like registered apprenticeships or to become a diesel mechanic, or the Oregon Saves program for people who work for businesses that don't offer an internal retirement plan. Treasurer also serves ex officio on the State Board of Education, on the Oregon Growth Board, on the Debt Policy Advisory Commission, the Municipal Debt Advisory Commission, and on the State Land Board. So the State Land Board is obviously critically important for managing the large amount of land that the state itself owns and controls, and whether that's all of our rivers or our beaches or our state forests, those are critical to be managed in the best possible way for Oregonians. So those are just some of the things that I'm thinking about as I move forward in pursuing this job.
Thank you. And Mary, same question for you. What would be your priorities as treasurer if elected, and what would Oregonians see as a result of your taking office?
I think I neglected, I'm going to answer that, but I think I neglected to answer the second part of your first question, Helen. And that was why I think I'm the candidate best qualified for the office. And I would say along those lines that, number one, I've researched and discussed economics now for decades, and I believe that a strong grasp of economics and the way the economy works is a big asset for the state treasurer. I think we need to be asking more questions of our advisors for our investments. I also feel like I'm paying more attention than others to the outsized and dangerous role of private equity in the PERS portfolio, especially where it's now more than half of our nearly $100 billion hidden in some various different funds. I am quite interested in the potential for a state bank and think there are federal dollars that could help us get that started. And I believe that we need to reach zero emissions more quickly than the current zero emissions plan calls for. I don't think we have a generation to do that. Last, though, I learned as a faculty member in the PSU Econ department, which my time there included 6 years as chair, and also as president. I did a stint as president of the Union of Full-Time Faculty Members, including librarians, student advisors, and other people that aren't instantly thought of when people think about the faculty. And I've seen the damage to our universities and heard about it in schools and other state agencies due to the legislature's historic underfunding of the PERS system. Backfilling PERS takes too big a chunk of already very lean budgets, and we need to better fund PERS. We have unrealistic expectations of the return for a fund that needs to meet short-term, medium-term, and long-term objectives. And we just frankly expect too much from the PERS portfolio. So that's why I think I'm well qualified for the position. My priorities, I think probably you understood from that answer. So hopefully those are clear. I have not yet mentioned, though, I think we should be continuing our savings plan. I think it's also important to recognize the perhaps unusual role of the treasurer in managing the state forests, where I think we need to be switching to searching for income for the schools fund from letting the trees grow and selling carbon credits. And getting anything else? I don't think so.
Great,
Could I
thank
just
you.
comment on a couple of things Mary
Sure.
said? That'd be all right, Helen. Thank you so much.
Are we going to do that?
Excuse me?
Shall we comment on each other's answers?
You're
Well,
welcome
Helen
to,
offered
as
us
long as
that-
it doesn't get.
No, I don't. I will. I have nothing disparaging to say in the slightest, and I would not dream of doing so. I just want to offer some other thoughts. I appreciate Mary's background as an economist and her expertise in that regard, and I do think that that's valuable. I would add, though, that one of the things I bring to the position is my extensive experience in state government. Agree or disagree with some of the work that I've done, it is important to know how to get things done. If the treasurer wants to move policy forward, she has to understand how to work closely with the legislature and other executive branch agencies. I'll give a good example. The current treasurer and others, myself included, helped pass Senate Bill 3 in 2023, which implements financial literacy education in our schools. And the State Board of Education was debating how to do that and was talking about pursuing a path that really wasn't congruent with what the legislature had intended. Our current treasurer, Treasurer Reed, having been a legislator, understood how to interpret the legislative record, how to talk with people, and how to negotiate through these issues with the director of the Department of Education and the members of the State Board of Education, where the treasurer sits ex officio. So I think that capacity to work closely with legislators and with other executive branch members and to understand how to navigate the position and the system is a critically important part of the treasurer's job and the job description and one of the qualifications. There's no doubt that understanding economics is important. And I think that's the kind of expertise that we have both internal to Treasury and can be brought in from the outside. But understanding how to navigate the system is not something that can be brought in from outside.
Great.
So I would just add that point.
And Mary, do you want to respond? I mean, does political experience matter?
I'm sure it does. I think Senator Steiner is a very strong candidate. I do think that the treasurer position is a more technical position than many. And I've talked to a previous state economist about the way that he worked with the treasurer. I think leading the Oregon Investment Council is really important. And I think working with the Treasury staff, who I think are strong and capable people, but I think it's very helpful to be able to dig in a little deeper.
Great. Let's see. I think, Mary, if you can go first on this question. We have upwards of I believe last time I checked, $28 billion unfunded liability for for PERS. And as you mentioned, rates of return continue to be significantly lower than expected. What concrete measures would you support or advocate for to reduce that unfunded liability?
I think we need to raise more revenue. I don't think that we can expect the PERS fund to deliver. I think we are, in fact, I think that expectation has pushed us and a lot of other states that have similarly underfunded their pension systems to enter too far into risky, inflexible, and dangerous and destructive investments, particularly in private equity.
So how would you raise additional revenue to meaningfully bring that down?
I think we have two ways to go about it. I think there is bonding, but I also think for the longer term that we need to talk about raising taxes in the state, particularly creating some higher tiers on the income tax bracket and also exploring the potential for a wealth tax.
And that would go specifically just to paying down the PERS liability?
Well, I think that's clearly a conversation to be had with the legislature. We face a lot of needs in this state. I think we recognize that we are unable to rely on the federal government as much as we might wish for housing, healthcare, mental health care, some of these other challenges that we face. So I think there's a need for a conversation about how to raise more revenue in Oregon.
Thank you. Elizabeth, same question for you. Knowing how large the unfunded liability is, what measures would you support to meaningfully address that?
You know, as a physician, I worked really hard to practice evidence-based medicine. And I think we have to be looking hard at evidence-based investing as well. I'm going to be asking a lot of hard questions about whether our investment strategies use the best practices available throughout the industry and throughout the business literature. And that's something I've been reading a lot of over the past year and getting up to speed on and talking with investment advisors and experts from around the country so that I can gain a better understanding of it. There is no way to guarantee a better rate of return, right? I mean, anytime you listen to any ad for financial advisors, they warn you that you cannot guarantee any particular rate of return. That's certainly true of a $95 billion fund. what we can do is be very thoughtful and very deliberate and in how we approach it. I appreciate the concerns that Mary's raised about private equity. I would point out, however, that to obtain the kinds of returns that we have to obtain for the portfolio, the pension fund, we have to have a very diversified portfolio, and that includes private equity. Is it at the right percentage? I think that remains to be seen, but determining the actual percentage of private equity in the fund at any given moment depends on the value of other assets. So sometimes you have a denominator problem where it appears that the private equity is at a much higher percentage because other investments are undervalued at that particular time. So it's very important to take a long-term rolling average kind of understanding of that problem. Bonding, we are actually currently sitting on a lot of pension obligation bonds, which will be paid off in 2027. We sold those at a very opportune time when we were able to take advantage of rates that were very low for those bonds. And as a result, this isn't quite the correct use of the term, but arbitrage, in the sense that we were able to get a much better rate of return on our whole portfolio on that money that we had, the cash that we had generated by selling those bonds, than we were paying out in interest for debt service on those bonds. That is not the case currently, and I don't think we can count on that being the case in the future. So when we think about bonding, we have to be very thoughtful about, first of all, what our Constitution says about what kinds of bonding we can do. And second of all, when is the right time to do which kind of bonding for the benefit of the state. Do I think Oregon's tax structure needs to be reworked? Sure. Do I think raising taxes at this point in time is a good idea? No. I think we are seeing significant amount of flight. The demographic data that we are seeing from the state economists and from other demographers are showing that wealthy people are moving out of Oregon. I see Mary disagrees with me. You can respond if you want later, but I have seen these data as part of extensive work groups. I was on the governor's Central City Revitalization Task Force on the Taxation Committee, and we were seeing the data that showed that people were moving out of Multnomah County in particular, which is where most of the wealthiest Oregonians reside, Multnomah and Washington County. And we're seeing them leave because of the rate of taxes. And we have to be really thoughtful about where the marginal benefit is. And do I think that wealthy corporations and wealthy people might well be able to pay more taxes? Yes. Are there other ways to accomplish this rather than just raising taxes? Sure. You could think about kicker reform, where we protect the kicker for people who are earning $150,000 or less, families that are on $150,000 or less, and then using the remainder to, for example, to pay down the unfunded actuarial liability. That would have generated on the order of $3 billion just over the past 3 biennia, not to mention the kicker that was announced last week, or likely to occur last week. So I think we have to be strategic about how we do this in ways that don't force corporations or increase the likelihood that corporations and wealthy individuals move out of state.
And Mary, did you want to respond to that?
Well, there's several points in there I would respond to. One, no one on earth argues against a diverse portfolio, but Rex Kim has said recently that we have more than 55% of our PERS funds being held in private equity. We can't see it all because the allocations that are publicly reported don't show. We have multiple funds, and some of those private equity holdings are being, for instance, in our real estate fund or in some of these other funds. But it's also not the case that our allocations, the value of our allocations vary widely. Certainly they go up, bump up and down as value changes, but 55% is not going to look like 25% when we have a change in the stock market. That just doesn't happen. But I also agree that we need kicker reform. I think that, I hope, is on the agenda for the legislature. Certainly, I think we should stop returning the kicker to upper income households, of course. And it's one-time money. It's very unpredictable, driven by primarily capital gains, which are concentrated at the top. And we would need to put it into either a fund that will build or allocate it to one-time uses, but I think it's a very productive thing to think about. I hope we haven't gone as far as we can go already with kicker reform in the legislature. Now, what else? Oh, I did want to mention for private equity that it's not just another investment. The management practices, the business practices are incredibly destructive. And for instance, our Senator Jeff Merkley has a bill to require private equity to phase out of ownership of housing. And the results are clear in housing. There are several studies about that show, raised rents, decreased maintenance, increased eviction, that kind of thing. But the other point that I wanted to address was the quality of the evidence about people moving out of state. And I think it's very weak. I know Mike Rogaway had a recent article about the presentation to the United for Portland PAC that showed that the average income of movers recently is $104,000. And there was a lot of speculation that this was due to taxes, but that average wage, that household income, especially when you consider that that's gross and that people pay our high-end income taxes don't come into effect until after deductions, often about $35,000. So people who are moving, their average income, the big bulk of those people are not paying those taxes. They're not required to. So it's a leap to think that that's where our movement comes from. And the city of Portland did a study a couple of years ago, an insight survey study, where they interviewed people. I can't remember right now if they interviewed or if they just provided survey questionnaires. But the biggest reason that people moved, the biggest single reason, was for more affordable housing. And that bears out when you look at who we're losing. We're very much losing young families in our population, as are all the expensive urban counties, including Washington, Clackamas, and Clark. And the other big reason for moving, so the two reasons for moving accounted for nearly 3/4.
And I'm sorry, where is this information from? Because I feel like I've seen conflicting information, or at least a lack of data behind like who exactly is moving. Are they young families, et cetera?
Well, multiple things are happening. Multiple things are happening, certainly. And I can share the links on the study done about young families. And I've seen myself the change in the age distribution of our county. We're losing families with young children, 0 to 4. I can send that link and or look it up in a minute and see. But the other big reason, the city of Portland did a study that they published in 2 iterations in 22 and 23. The second big reason people are moving was to be closer to families, work, and friends. So taxes aren't coming up as a big reason for movement, and they don't in other economic research for other situations where 2 states like ours have quite different tax regimes.
Mary, a couple quick questions about that. You said earlier that the people who are moving aren't paying those taxes. Are you meaning the taxes on their gross income, federal taxes, and state income taxes, or do you mean that the Multnomah County specific taxes?
I'm referring to the Multnomah County specific taxes, the
Okay.
preschool and housing support taxes, which I believe generated a lot of the conversation in the governor's downtown task force and is the focus now of political action.
Okay, and then just so I'm clear, what do you think changed? We run these numbers going back many years now, and what do you think changed in 2021 and 2022 that created that sort of hockey stick effect? Is that one-time capital gains? Is it a problem with data? Well, so when you look at the data, we've had sort of a steady increase in the incomes of people moving into the county over the past 15 years, with a blip around the pandemic, but it's more or less on the same trajectory. But then we have this hockey stick effect in 2021 and 2022, where the incomes of people leaving, according to the IRS data, is up sharply. I'm just curious what triggered that.
Well, we have multiple things going on. One is we have a changing income distribution in the county, particularly over those years. And so, that's going to show up in movers regardless of whether or not, it doesn't mean that more high income people are moving. I would really like to see a sophisticated analysis of it that was a regression analysis that was looking at the contribution of different factors. Because the other thing that's happening too, of course, is high increases in housing costs. And we're seeing with other high housing cost metro areas around the country, we're seeing that we are losing immigrants from lower cost arenas. The only people now moving to the Portland metro area, including surrounding counties, are coming from high housing cost metro areas also. So I think there are more factors than can be well understood within a single graph looking at only part of it.
All right. And then a question for each of you, if you don't mind me jumping in. Helen, real quick. You've each addressed private equity, and Mary, you addressed it in a little more detail there. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more. Do you have philosophical objections? And Mary, it sounds like you do, to private equity and the way it operates. And if so, how do you balance that with the fiduciary duties that you have? For example, with housing, it could cut both ways. Private equity, anything that's infusing capital into the housing market, be potentially valuable in creating housing supply, right?
Did you want to address that?
Go ahead, please.
I
Sounds like
wouldn't say
he was starting with you, so I'm happy to chime in when appropriate.
But both of you, either way. Let's start with the broad question. And so, Mary, since you were just talking, maybe I'll go with you first, Elizabeth. And let me ask the broad question: is your own thoughts about private equity, and if you have a philosophical objection to it, and if so, what that philosophical objection is, and then how you balance those objections to the fiduciary duty you'd have as treasurer.
Let me start with the main question. I do not have a philosophical objection to private equity. I think that we have very complex financial markets now, and we need to have the ability to invest in businesses in a wide range of ways, including the fact, private equity is investing not only in traded sector companies, but also in private companies, obviously, that are not yet able to go on the market. And that's really important because we have to have a wide range of sources of capital for all sorts of different companies. That's how, and investing in companies and building companies is a much more complex task now. Finding the capital is a much more complex task now than it was 30 to 50 years ago. And one of the reasons we've seen a rise in private equity is because of that complexity. So philosophically, I don't have an objection to private equity. The place that I start to run into trouble with private equity is when, as Mary alluded to, private equity firms come in and prioritize short-term profit over long-term, sensible, steady returns. And we see this potentially in the residential housing, in the housing market. I don't know enough of the details there. The place I know the most is around the healthcare system, right? And I have some significant concerns, I will freely admit, about private equity as owners of hospitals, health systems, physician practices, things like that. There are some that behave in entirely honorable ways, and they are offering services for management and things like that so that the healthcare providers don't have to be focused on that. That's great. And there are some bad actors who make different decisions about what kinds of care to offer, depending on payer source, for the patient and things like that. As a physician, I can't tolerate that kind of discrimination. I can't tolerate a mentality of profit over patient outcomes or evidence-based practice approach, and I find that problematic. Do I think the bill the legislature had in 2024 was the right one? I think it could use some work, but I think the version that we would have passed had we had time, ultimately, that we revamped in the Senate was much closer to something plausible. And so I think we have to continue to ask really hard questions about private equity and the ethics of the companies that are doing this work. And we cannot afford to throw the baby out with the bathwater by saying that all private equity is bad. So I would take a fairly, as I often do in this world, a very middle of the road approach. I tend to try to look hard at the pros and cons of almost any decision and almost any type of entity and figure out how do we ask the right questions so that we're getting the best possible outcome out of it and minimizing the downsides, whatever those downsides are. And
Mary,
that's
how's that square?
my philosophy.
Mary, how does that square with your thinking?
I don't have a philosophical objection to private equity. Firms can be owned privately. They don't need to be selling their shares to the public. I have a problem with the business record of a lot of private equity firms, which we've been learning a lot more about in recent years. There's been a lot more published about it. And as Elizabeth points out, healthcare is one of those areas where some private equity firms' record is dismal. The Portland Business Journal covered this recently for health organizations locally. And others have testified to it on the national level about increased deaths and worse conditions and poor quality care. So I think nothing of any kind of group of people or organization is bad. Not all. Well, anyway, understand what I'm saying. I'm saying we can't use a broad brush and characterize everybody as being the same. However, it is the case that a great many private equity funds are operating in an irresponsible manner, very short-term perspective, and stripping assets out of firms that they purchase, saddling them with the debt that they have acquired to purchase those firms in the first place, and really making their money before even selling them. And many have gone, the firms that they sell off after being stripped of their assets have gone bankrupt. I think we're all aware of some of the big names, Sears, Neiman Marcus, some of these other groups. There's been a lot of publicity about it. So I think that we definitely need to have more attention to how much private equity we're investing in. I think it's challenging sometimes to know what private equity funds might do. There's not much transparency when you join up about what exactly they will purchase and then how they'll manage it. So we have to look more carefully to see if we can about what the records of any fund might be, as well as, I think, phase out to a lower level to something closer to our original allocations for private equity so that we aren't so overinvested. It's a problem. The other thing that's happening, as the Wall Street Journal was pointing out, is big institutional investors are not being paid on time. They're struggling. Private equity is struggling with higher interest rates. They don't have as much advantage as they used to by being debt, their engine being debt, by purchasing companies with a lot of debt. So I think there are a number of counts on which we're far overinvested in private equity. We need to look at that carefully and carefully phase it down.
So Mary, let me ask you, in terms of, if elected, I'm sorry?
I didn't answer about fiduciary duty.
Actually, that dovetails with my question. So if you can, that'd be great.
Sure. And I think fiduciary duty is often misunderstood as getting maximum return. And our fiduciary duty in the PERS fund is really loyalty to the beneficiaries. Our beneficiaries, PERS recipients and their families, are Oregonians, and we have a duty to them. We're creating the future that they and their families will live in. I think we have a strong duty to them to make sure that we are not funding their retirements in ways that will be destructive for our own economy. There are too many private equity firms, both are job killers and business killers, and quality killers in terms of what they're offering. And I think that's not something that we should be participating in, particularly at the extent that we currently are.
So can you talk a little bit more about that in terms of what would drive your decisions or oversight as treasurer? Like, for instance, there is Treasurer Reed's plan for getting to net zero by, I believe, 2050. But what would be, like, are there other social, environmental, political stands with which you would, or lenses with which you would look at our investments in PERS or any of the other funds? And Mary, if you can go first on this, and then Elizabeth.
I think that, yes, in general, I believe there are other stands that we should be thinking about. And I think they're very connected to risk and quality of life in the future. I think we need a very future-oriented view and vision as we think about our role. $140 billion in investment, more than 2/3 of it in PERS, is not a small amount of money. The Oregon economy is as bigger than 3/4 of countries. You know, we need to play a positive role on climate change. I think we have a responsibility to help uphold labor standards and other standards that dramatically affect the quality of lives of Oregonians in the future.
Elizabeth, same question for you.
Sure. I think it's possible to do well by doing good and do good at the same time, which is to say that, for example, the literature shows that companies with more diverse boards have better bottom lines. So insisting, as Massachusetts Treasurer Goldberg has done, that Massachusetts votes its proxy shares against reappointment of boards, the members of boards who are on the nominating committee, if the boards don't have at least 30% women, is a good fiduciary move, right? It's not just woke, if you'll forgive the term, investing. It's smart investing because it's about getting the best return on investment from those companies. And companies with more diverse boards, whether that's gender diverse or racially and ethnically diverse, generally speaking, have better bottom lines. When you think about things like labor standards, the data also show that companies that treat their workers better tend to have better bottom lines. So I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a both and. And so it's very important to bear in mind that when we make these investment decisions, we are thinking about fundamentally making sure that we continue to grow the pension fund and doing it in ways that prioritize investments that also are congruent with the values that, generally speaking, we've upheld as Oregonians. And whether that's treating workers well or moving towards a more diverse group of stakeholders and a diverse group of voices, those are things Oregonians prioritize and think are important as a whole, not everyone, but as a whole. And they are ways to maximize the return on investment simultaneously. And those are the lenses that I would use. And while I hear Mary's point about investing for the future and the future we want to create, I would just add that if we do that and we focus so much on what's going on 25 years from now, that we're not focused on what's going on 5 years from now, which I don't necessarily think is what she was saying, but I do want to point this out. We have to be careful because if we aren't getting the returns that we need, that's going to continue to increase significantly the amount that public employers have to pay in as part of paying down their portion of the unfunded liability. And that's going to be less money to go toward actual program. So I think it's a both and. Yes, we have to plan for the future. Yes, we have to help create a model for investing in, for example, environmentally smart ways, and simultaneously continue to protect the growth of the pension fund so we don't have an adverse impact on public employer budgets.
So Elizabeth, how do you meet those multiple objectives with the huge number of companies that PERS is, or funds that PERS is invested in? For instance, are you talking about going through a company by company evaluation, or how would you actually achieve that?
That's a great question, and I'm not sure I can give you a great answer to it yet because I'm still learning about the exact process by which we evaluate each and every one of our investments. You've known me long enough, Helen, to know that I'm very careful about saying what I know and what I don't know. And one of the things that I think qualifies me well for this job is that I have demonstrated that I can learn a lot in a very short period of time by doing the homework, even about things that I have relatively little experience. So I am not engaging with Treasury investment staff now. That would be presumptuous of me, but I am preparing to do that. And I am preparing lists of questions, and I'm preparing through conversations with outside investment advisors and national experts by developing a list of questions that I plan to ask after I win the seat, even as soon as the beginning of November, after November 5th. And in preparation for taking office in January, and then what I'll be doing over the first few months that I'm in office. So yes, I plan to ask a lot of very hard questions to figure out the most efficient, effective way to make those determinations. I don't know. In some cases, it might be a company by company evaluation on an ongoing basis. We have opportunities every year to vote our proxy shares. That's a way to make our values known that we should be taking full advantage of. Proxy share voting is managed by an outside company based on rules that we give to that company. We should be looking hard at what those rules are and making determinations about whether those need to be updated to reflect how we think we should be making our investments. So those are some of the strategies we can use. I'm sure there are more, and I look forward to learning about them.
And Mary, same question for you. How would you go about meeting the various objectives you have for just the various investments that we hold?
Sure. And of course, Elizabeth's right that we're investing for the short, medium, and long term. We have retirees now. We have people who will retire shortly, facing the baby boom retirement, and we have people who won't retire for some time. So we face all those sorts of questions. And I would say that the way our investments are managed is not individually company by the treasurer's office, but they hire several managers according to the priorities that the treasurer's office has. So I think it's not as challenging a task for the treasurer's office itself as it first appears to be vetting individual companies, but really you're hiring financial advisors, managers of funds who make their own decisions based on clearly established policy priorities. And those are the kinds of things that the Treasurer's Office, I think, needs to be, and I believe is, continually evaluating. What are our policies when we're choosing for fund managers? And I think they need continuous scrutiny and implementation.
You had said earlier that you felt that Treasurer Reed's plan for net zero emissions portfolio is not ambitious enough, if I'm correctly paraphrasing. How would you, I guess, speed up that timeline?
Well, I think we first have to set the goals. I think we know that 2050 is too late. We don't have another generation to be fighting catastrophic climate change. That said, we also know we don't have lots of alternatives in the current moment. So we need to set ourselves a more ambitious plan and then figure out how to accomplish it. Now, I think there are a number of ways to do that, not all of which can be perhaps most of which can't be accomplished alone by the treasurer's office. One of the things that we might need to look into is, for instance, charging higher rates to big users of electricity in our state. We have quite a number of big data centers and that kind of thing who are putting a strain on the demand for electricity. If we know that we're transitioning to electricity, which at least our electricity is pretty clean as compared to many other states, then we can't be offering it at the same price or to everybody. We need to create incentives to be conserving energy for the things that are more needed, and or charging the prices that really reflect what it means for an outfit like a data center to use so very much of what we're producing.
Okay, I'd like to, because we're actually beginning to run out of time, move on just to the question about bonding capacity. And Elizabeth, I think, or actually Mary, you can go first on this. The need for capital spending just far exceeds what Oregon has the ability to issue in bonds. You've got, from schools, modernizations, seismic retrofits, transportation, any number of things. What are the priorities that you would have for how to use that bonding capacity? Or would you seek to change kind of what Oregon has deemed to be a proper level of debt capacity?
I would like to have a careful look at the way that we've historically set our ideas about what our bonding capacity is. I'm totally cognizant of the fact that what we pay for bonds depends on maintaining the quality of our credit rating, and that relates to how much we bond compared to the size of our economy and our state revenue. But I would like to look more carefully. I have thought at quick examination that we perhaps are too cautious, but that's something that would need some careful study. As far as prioritizing, I agree with you, Helen, that we have big needs and we need to think about it carefully. And we might think about even needs that we have not yet put on that list, because right now we are focusing our bonding on physical capital, physical infrastructure. And I know that when I was working with a group of people to reconsider how we fund our universities, to reduce the role of tuition and fees, which have gone up so much for students as we reduce our state investment, that we consider a system called Pay It Forward, where students in fact pay not upfront, but a percent of their income after graduating over a certain threshold. And we were talking in that time with the treasurer's office, who was considering the idea, Ted Wheeler at the time, who was considering the idea of suggesting that we bond not just for physical capital, but also for human capital. And the point being that that could fund an investment, because changing the way we fund our universities like that would require upfront money to get started, as a bank would. And that then would be not, but it would be one time, as people were able to pay back and fill that for future generations, future students.
And so would that be your top priority in terms of just how to use that debt capacity, or affordable housing? What are, I guess, some of the other areas that you think the state absolutely needs to issue bonds for?
I would need to study harder to know exactly how anything should be allocated, and talk to many more people about it. But I do see a huge need for us to be putting much more into housing, the full spectrum of housing needs, even as we're trying to do that already, and healthcare, including mental health care and substance abuse and that kind of thing, as well as our crumbling infrastructure. And I think we saw a big example of the needs we don't very much recognize during the recent strike by the Portland Association of Teachers, where one of their demands unmet was that the classrooms not be colder than 60 degrees or hotter than 80 degrees. I found that a shocking kind of item to have to be included in a list of what they were trying to bargain for. It was remarkable to me. And so I think we're in worse straits than we sometimes realize.
Great, thank you. And Elizabeth, same question for you. What would be your priorities?
I think it's important to start by reminding ourselves that the treasurer doesn't actually choose how to allocate bonds. That's the legislature's job. Or in the case of transportation revenue-backed bonds, the Highway Trust Fund, those are decisions made by the Oregon Transportation Commission. So the treasurer's job is to work with the rest of the Debt Policy Advisory Commission to determine what the bonding capacity is, using for the moment our current cap of 5% for general fund, for general obligation bonds for debt service, and then to sell bonds for the things that the legislature determines. I've been on the other side of that equation for quite some time now, and I think overall we've done a pretty good job. As Mary quite rightly points out, and you point out, there is way more need than there is capacity. And that's due to generations of inadequate investment, whether that's in housing or roads and bridges or rail or public transit or any number of things. That being said, our debt capacity is our debt capacity at the moment, assuming we stick to that 5% debt service threshold. You can make a compelling argument that we should increase that threshold by even doing so by a percentage or two would give us more debt capacity. The challenge that I have with my experience on the budget committee is that every dollar we spend on debt service is a dollar we don't spend on direct program. It's exactly the same as spending money on paying down our PERS unfunded liability. So debt service money gets us something in the sense that maybe it gets us new housing built or new bridges repaired or something like that. But it doesn't necessarily actually put teachers in classrooms or troopers on the road to keep us safe. And so we have to be really, really thoughtful about all of the pros and cons as we think about increasing our debt capacity through raising the cap on our debt service limit. I can see arguments both ways, and I'd be prepared to engage in those arguments. The treasurer's most important role in all of this is selling bonds in the most advantageous way. And that means working with the investment banks and with our internal debt management team to determine the best time to sell bonds, the right quantities to sell at any given time, the right types of bonds to sell, because we're actually selling multiple types of bonds that actually get different kinds of interest rates on them as we go forward. And we have to be really strategic about that. And that's something that I've worked closely with Treasury on during the past 6 years as co-chair of the Ways and Means Committee and serving on the Capital Construction Committee. Those are conversations that we've been engaged in on an ongoing basis because we have to factor in debt service into the budget as we think about when bonds will be sold and what the likely interest rates are, right? So do I think there are other things we could consider selling bonds for? Possibly. Most of them would require constitutional change because, as I'm sure you all know, every single kind of bond we sell required its own constitutional amendment. They're all in Article 11 of our Constitution. And we would have to think about whether we could sell bonds under an existing article, although I don't think we could, for human capital, or whether we would have to authorize a new constitutional amendment. And if we did that, how would we think about balancing out the cost of the debt service against and the benefits of increasing that debt service compared to the other things we could do with that money? I don't think there's a clear answer to that question, but it's something that I will always keep an open mind about.
So I want to give you guys both a minute to give a wrap up. So Mary, is it something that you can work into your closing?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm just going to have a real quick question for both of you. Elizabeth, my question for you is, you've received tens of thousands of dollars from out-of-state law firms. One of the concerns that we had was regarding independence from donors. What would you tell voters in terms of just, both with the out-of-state law firms and, would that affect how you make decisions about class action lawsuits to pursue, for instance? Or, how can you assure voters of your independence?
I have two answers to that question. The first is that the reason out-of-state law firms have given me money is because they share my belief that we have to hold corporations responsible for acting in ways that knowingly reduce our return on investment by not making their corporation as profitable if they're doing so in ways that are incongruent with standard corporate responsibility, right? For example, we're now engaged in a lawsuit against Fox because they knowingly continued to perpetuate their lies against some of the voting machine companies. And as a result, the value of their stock diminished, but they knew that it was a problem based on generations of lawsuits. This corollary to that piece is the treasurer doesn't actually make those decisions about who to sue. That's a conversation that the law firms have with the attorney general. And that's how it's set up in our state for exactly that reason. The treasurer gives the law firms information based on a complex system that I won't bore you with the moment, but that assuming Representative Rayfield becomes the AG, he and I are already talking about how do we revamp that to increase transparency and increase inclusiveness. But the treasurer doesn't actually make decisions about which companies to sue or which law firm gets the business of being the primary firm on the lawsuit. So no matter how much money I get from those firms, I wouldn't be involved in those direct decision makings. The last point I would make is that I have often made decisions that are against the interests of companies that have given me money. The most recent example is that twice in the past week, I was out on the picket lines with UFCW and their strike against Fred Meyer, despite the fact that UFCW endorsed my opponent in the primary, has not endorsed me for the general, and Kroger has given me, which is the parent company for Fred Meyer, has given me a lot of money over the years. I did it because it was what was right for the workers and congruent with my values, and I didn't really care whether Kroger had given me money. So I could give you lots of examples like that, but my track record's pretty clear that I'm perfectly happy to vote against the interests of previous donors.
Great, thank you very much. And Mary, my question for you is, you're a fairly recent entrant into the treasurer's race. Why should voters think that you are genuinely interested in leading this office?
I think that I am genuinely interested, so I'm telling people that. But the other thing to think about is the strategy of, I think, believed in by both the Working Family Party and the Pacific Green Party, which nominated me, that it's important to introduce a wider range of perspectives and other topics into the conversation. And I think that's a big part of the role that I play in this election. And let me just say, well, I have the floor for a minute, that one thing I want to just point out to everybody is when we go into debt as the public sector, one of the things that we critically have to think about is whether it's an investment and in which ways it will pay off and raise our state revenues. Because that is part of the equation. Yes, we absolutely have to pay debt service out of the budget, but it's also the case that we want to undertake the kinds of investments that will, in fact, better our budgets in the future. And it doesn't have to be a long future. So for instance, housing. If we have people off the streets, then we pay less for our police, our jails, our emergency room healthcare, and this comes back to us. So that's just part of how we need to be thinking about what debt we take on.
Great, thank you. I'm going to give each of you just a minute to sum up whatever message you want voters to take away. Mary, if you wouldn't mind going first.
Well, I think that what I'd like voters to know is I think very few people have an understanding about what the state treasurer's office does and what the role of the state treasurer is. I would like people to know that I think we need to look much more carefully at our allocation of our investments, which is certainly the single biggest responsibility that I understand the treasurer has. And I would like us, the people, to understand that we have the possibility to work with the legislature to create a state bank that could collaborate with community banks and other local investors in order to do economic development around the state while saving fees from Wall Street management of our funds, and also supporting at the same time then our students, our farmers, and our small businesses with low interest loans. And that there's federal dollars available right now for green economy type projects, millions, hundreds of millions of federal dollars available that the state has yet to think about claiming. And the last thing I would like to point out is I think we can be managing our state forests in a better manner and to help fight climate change. And I think that we can be also looking for avenues to support family foresters to help them enter cooperatives or pools so that they can also take advantage more easily of carbon credits rather than having to log early.
Great, thank you very much. And Elizabeth, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I appreciate the fact that Mary's in the race. I'm totally fine with that. I think people should have a choice. What I would say is, I think it's important that the state treasurer have extensive experience in state government, have a demonstrated track record, have priorities that are clearly on display. Anybody can take a look at my website and see what my priorities are and exactly the kinds of policies I'd be interested in pursuing. I think having somebody who has the interests of all Oregonians at heart. Over the past year that I've been running for this seat, I've been in 2/3 of our counties for work, to meet with people, to hear their concerns, to address them. And that's one of the reasons, the fact that I've been showing up all across the state the entire time I've been in office, that I have endorsements from rural and urban legislators and county commissioners and mayors. And I think what that shows is that the treasurer is a statewide position and that I see it as such. And I recognize that the needs of Oregonians are not identical. Fundamentally, there are some that are the same. Everybody needs to have a family wage job and be able to afford the basics in life. Those are the things that are important to people's well-being. And that's one of the things that interests me about the job. But fundamentally, understanding how to meet the needs of people across the state and to do so in ways that benefits the entire state economically is something that I bring to the table in a way that I think is unique. My Republican opponent hasn't even shown up for this interview, which disappoints me because I think voters deserve to know what his priorities are, and they aren't on his website, and he's not showing up at these interviews. So that disappoints me because it's unclear how people are supposed to learn who they want to choose if people don't show up. And so what I would say is people need to understand that I'm a lifelong learner, that I have a track record that demonstrates that I show up to work, that I show up around the state, and I'm a good listener who really cares deeply about the economic well-being of our state as a whole and individual Oregonians.
Thank you both very much. We really appreciate your time this morning.
Thank you.
Right.
Take good care, you guys.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.